So many people today find themselves trapped in fear, trapped in doubt, trapped in the past. They feel like they can't escape the weight of their mistakes, their failures, their regrets. They sit in the same place year after year, waiting for something to change, waiting for a sign, waiting for God to move. But what if I told you God is already speaking? What if I told you He has been telling you to move forward, but you haven't been listening? When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea, they were trapped. Behind them, Pharaoh's army thundered across the desert, and ahead of them, nothing but an endless sea. Fear gripped them. They cried out to Moses, "Did you bring us here to die?" But do you know what God said? He didn't say, "Wait and see." No, He said, "Go forward. Move, step into the impossible, step into what looks like uncertain." And when they did, when Moses lifted his staff, when they took that step of obedience, God split the sea. Some of you are standing before your own Red Sea right now. You see no way through. You think, "I'll just stay where I am. Maybe God will do something later." But God is already speaking. He's already saying, "Move, walk by faith, step into the unknown." And until you take that step, until you move in obedience, you will stay stuck. Remember Lot's wife? God told her family to leave Sodom, to run and not look back. But she turned around. She couldn't let go of what was behind her. And in that moment, she was frozen, turned into a pillar of salt. She was stuck. Why? Because she disobeyed the call to move forward. Some of you are still looking back at a past God has told you to leave behind. You replay old wounds, past relationships, past failures. But God is saying, stop looking back. The future is ahead, not behind. Think about Peter on the water. He was in the boat, safe, secure, but when Jesus said, "Come," Peter did something no one else dared to do. He stepped out. He walked on water. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus, the moment he focused on the storm, he began to sink. That's where so many people are today. They start to move, they start to step into faith, but then doubt creeps in. They see the wind, the wave, but Jesus didn't let Peter drown. He reached down and pulled him up. Right now, God is reaching for you. He's saying, step out, move forward, don't be afraid. Fear is a liar. Fear will keep you in the boat. Fear will tell you it's safer to stay where you are. But faith says, if God calls me, I will go. If He says move, I will step out. If He tells me to leave the past behind, I won't look back. You may say, but I don't know where I'm going. Neither did Abraham. God told him, go to the land I will show you. He didn't get a map. He didn't get all the details. He just got a command, go. And when he obeyed, God led him to the land of promise. You may say, but I've failed too many times. So did David, so did Peter, so did Paul. But God doesn't call the perfect. He calls the willing. He says, get up, try again, move. Some of you feel stuck because of your past sins. You think God can't use me. I've made too many mistakes. But do you know who God used? A murderer named Moses, a prostitute named Rahab, a persecutor named Paul. God doesn't see what the world sees. He sees the potential inside you. He sees who you can become if you trust Him. Don't let the past hold you. Don't let fear chain you. Don't let doubt silence you. God is calling you to move forward. Take that step. Start that ministry. Forgive that person. Leave that toxic relationship. Break that addiction. Walk into the calling He has for you. Feeling trapped uncertain, and unable to move forward is one of the greatest struggles people face. Fear, doubt, and the weight of the past often hold us back. But when we look to God, we see that He is always calling His people to move, not to sit still, not to stay in fear, but to take bold steps forward, even when the way seems impossible. In Exodus 14:15, the Israelites stood on the edge of the Red Sea. Behind them, Pharaoh's army was closing in, determined to drag them back into slavery. In front of them, nothing but deep, impassable waters stretched out. The people were terrified. They cried out, asking Moses why he had led them there, why he had brought them into a situation where escape seemed impossible. To the natural eye, there was no way forward. There was only destruction behind them and an uncrossable barrier ahead. But what did God say? He did not say turn back. He did not say stay where you are. He said go forward. That command didn't make sense. How could they move forward when there was a sea blocking their way? How could they take a step when there was no visible path? But that is how faith works. Faith is stepping into what seems impossible, believing that if God has commanded it, He will make a way. The moment Moses lifted his staff, the waters parted. The moment the Israelites obeyed and stepped forward, they walked on dry ground. If they had hesitated, if they had stayed in their fear, they would have been overtaken by Pharaoh's army. Their salvation came only when they moved forward in obedience. This is what so many people fail to realize. They wait for God to clear the way before they take a step. They want to see the whole plan before they obey. But God does not work that way. He calls us to move in faith, to trust Him before we see the miracle. If the Israelites had waited until the sea was already parted, they would have never taken that step of faith. The miracle followed their movement. The same is true in our lives. Many people stay stuck in difficult situations because they refuse to move. They let fear paralyze them. They tell themselves, I'll move when God shows me the way, not realizing that God is waiting for them to take the first step. Think about Peter when he was in the boat. Jesus was standing on the water, calling him forward. If Peter had stayed in the boat, he never would have experienced the miracle of walking on water. But the moment he stepped out, while the storm was still raging, while the waves were still crashing, he did the impossible. He walked toward Jesus. The power was not in the water. The power was in his obedience to move forward. Many people today are stuck because they refuse to step into the unknown. They cling to their past, their comfort zones, their familiar struggles, even when God is calling them to something greater. But faith requires action. God moves when we move. Look at Abraham. God told him to leave his homeland and go to a place He would show him. But God didn't give him all the details. Abraham had to leave before he knew where he was going. That is faith. Look at the lepers Jesus healed in Luke 17. He told them to go show themselves to the priests, but they were still sick when He said it. It wasn't until they moved that they were healed. Their healing was tied to their obedience to go forward. This is what God is telling you today. Stop waiting for everything to be perfect. Stop waiting for the fear to leave. Stop waiting for the full picture. Move. Step out in faith. Take that action God has been asking you to take, because when you move, He moves. When you take that first step, He clears the way. When you walk in obedience, He makes the impossible possible. The Israelites would have perished if they had stayed still. Peter would have never walked on water if he had stayed in the boat. Abraham would have never reached the promised land if he had waited for more details. And you, if you refuse to move forward, you will never see what God has prepared for you. There is a reason God calls us to move forward. There is a reason He warns us about looking back, because when you turn your eyes to the past, when you fix your heart on what God has already called you to leave behind, you become stuck. You stop growing. You stop moving. You stop receiving what He has for you. Lot's wife is one of the clearest examples of this truth in the Bible. She had been given a clear command: do not look back. She and her family had been rescued from destruction. God had sent His angels to pull them out of Sodom before it was wiped away. But as they were fleeing, something inside of her couldn't let go. Something inside of her longed for what was behind. Maybe it was the comfort of the life she had known. Maybe it was the relationship she was leaving behind. Maybe it was fear of an unknown future. Whatever it was, it caused her to do the one thing God told her not to do. She turned around. And in that instant, she was frozen in place, turned into a pillar of salt. Lot's wife wasn't just physically stuck. Her heart had been stuck long before she ever turned her head. She couldn't move forward because she had never truly let go of the past. And there are so many people today who are just like her. They are physically in a new place, but their hearts are still trapped in what was. They say they want to move forward, but their minds are constantly replaying old mistakes, old hurts, old relationships. They stay chained to past regrets, past sins, past disappointments. And because they refuse to release what God has told them to leave behind, they remain stuck. This is one of the greatest tricks of the enemy. He knows that as long as you are focused on the past, you cannot move into the future God has for you. He will whisper reminders of your failures. He will replay old wounds. He will keep you bound in shame and guilt and nostalgia for things that were never meant to last. But the truth is, you cannot embrace the new life God has for you if you keep holding on to the past. The Apostle Paul understood this when he said, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal, Philippians 3:13-14. He knew that looking back would only slow him down. He knew that no matter what he had done in the past, no matter how many mistakes, no matter how much sin, his calling was ahead of him, not behind. And that is true for you too. Think about the Israelites after they left Egypt. God had rescued them from slavery, but as soon as things got difficult, they started longing for their old life. They said, we were better off in Egypt. They had been set free, but their minds were still enslaved. Because of their unbelief, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years stuck, never reaching the promised land because they couldn't stop looking back. How many people today are just like that? They say they want freedom, but deep down they are still tied to their past. They are still holding on to toxic relationships, still reliving old failures, still carrying burdens that God has already forgiven. But God is saying, let it go, stop looking back, move forward. Jesus himself warned about this when he said, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. Luke 9:62. A plowman who looks back cannot plow straight. He veers off course. He becomes ineffective. And that's exactly what happens in our spiritual lives when we keep turning our eyes to the past. Right now, God is calling you forward. He is calling you into a future filled with purpose, with healing, with new beginnings. But you cannot step into it if you are still looking back. You must decide, will you be like Lot's wife, frozen in place because you refuse to let go? Or will you be like Paul, pressing forward with everything inside you? Faith is not about certainty. It is not about seeing every step before you take it. Faith is about stepping into the unknown, trusting that God will sustain you even when everything around you says otherwise. Peter learned this in one of the most powerful moments in the Bible. The disciples were on a boat, caught in the middle of a raging storm. The wind howled, the waves crashed, and fear gripped them. Then, in the distance, they saw a figure walking on the water. At first, they thought it was a ghost. But then Jesus spoke. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." At that moment, Peter had a choice. Stay in the boat where it was safe, or step into the unknown, where everything in the natural world said he would sink. But something inside Peter believed. Something inside him knew that if Jesus had called him, he could do the impossible. So he stepped out. And for a moment, Peter did what no other human has ever done. He walked on water, not because of his own power, but because of his faith. As long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus, he was sustained. As long as he kept his focus on the one who had called him, he walked in the supernatural. But then something happened. Peter looked at the wind. He saw the waves. Fear took hold of him. Doubt crept in. And the moment he allowed fear to take his eyes off Jesus, he began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me!" And immediately Jesus reached down and pulled him up. That is where so many people find themselves today. God calls them to step out, to take a risk, to leave behind their comfort, to follow him into the unknown. But instead of keeping their eyes on him, they focus on the storm. They focus on the uncertainty, the danger, the fear. And the moment they do, they begin to sink. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to move forward despite fear. Faith does not mean you will never feel doubt. It means you do not let doubt control you. Peter walked on water as long as his focus remained on Jesus. The storm was still there. The waves didn't stop. The wind didn't calm down until later. But Peter walked in the middle of the storm because his eyes were fixed on the one who had called him. God is calling you to step into something greater. Maybe he is asking you to start that ministry. Maybe he is asking you to leave behind a toxic situation. Maybe he is asking you to trust him in an area of your life where everything looks uncertain, but you are hesitating because you cannot see the full picture. You want a guarantee before you move, but that is not how faith works. Abraham was called to leave his homeland and go to a place God would show him, Genesis 12:01. He didn't get the full map. He didn't have all the details, but he obeyed. He stepped into the unknown, and because of that faith, God made him the father of nations. The lepers Jesus healed in Luke 17 were told to go and show themselves to the priests before they were healed. And as they went, they were made clean. Their healing came after their step of faith.